Almighty Father in heaven, in the name of your Son, our glorious and victorious Savior, Jesus Christ, we humbly ask for your blessing upon our worship of you on this, your holy and sanctified Sabbath day, so that we may grow more in our knowledge of you, our love for you, and our obedience to you. And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the midst of the street of it, and on either side of the river, was there the tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruits, and yielded her fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. And there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants shall serve him. And they shall see his face, and his name shall be in their foreheads. And there shall be no night there. They need no candle, neither light of the sun, for the Lord God giveth them light, and they shall reign forever and ever. The history of Israel, as recorded in the Scriptures, is often a matter of Israel's contacts or relationship with a series of empires that existed one after another from the time of Israel's beginning. That is to say, the Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek, and the Roman empires, one after another, existed through that time. They rose and they fell. Just as Israel, in fact, rose and fell a number of times in its history. It was for a time a free and independent nation, and for a lot of other times it was a conquered nation. And for a lot of other times the people of Israel weren't even there. For example, during the time in which they were in Egypt. And to this day the people of Israel, that is the northern kingdom of Israel, aren't there either. The people of Judah are. They've again returned and created a modern day nation for themselves, modern day country for themselves, but they certainly aren't an empire compared to, for example, back in the time of Solomon, in which was probably the closest that Israel, physical Israel, ever came to be an empire in human history. And we should explain just exactly what an empire is, because throughout history, throughout human history, the creators of an empire, the people of the central nation of an empire, often didn't recognize themselves as imperialist or empirist, since both words mean the same thing. Empire is merely the English version of the Roman word from which empire originated. It means the same thing. Imperialist or empirist just means the same thing. Emperor is also derived from the Roman word, who was a supreme ruler over other nations. Other nations had their own leaders, or were allowed to have their own leaders, or had their own leaders installed by the emperor, but it was the emperor who in effect ruled them, and pretty much let them have their own freedom as long as they didn't step out of line, upon which they would be invaded by the emperor's forces. So you see, the emperor was sort of a super king, or a ruler of rulers, or a king of kings. And that political situation is known as imperialism, and it has existed throughout human history. The bigger nations always ended up ruling over the smaller nations. Smaller and bigger not necessarily meaning territory either, because one of the most best-known empires of history, the British Empire, if you look at England, the British Isles, how relatively small they are compared to the vast area of earth that they ruled. The greatest modern-day example of an empire, and if you're a historian, you appreciate that the last couple of centuries can certainly be regarded as a modern era in a relative sense to all of human history, certainly was the British Empire. No other empire in human history was as geographically vast at its peak. And that's another fact about empires. They always decline. They always have. There's never been one yet that has not eventually declined. Not necessarily ceased to exist as a nation or as a people, but declined as an empire. And almost always for the same reason, in that they one way or another discovered, the easy way or the hard way, that the world is bigger than they were. That they simply weren't big enough to maintain their empire. There's only one king, one emperor that will have the power to do that, and that will be Jesus Christ when he brings the kingdom of God on earth and simply wipes away all human empires, all human kingdoms. But empires are not necessarily a bad thing. Again, using the example of the British Empire, it brought civilization to many people, many peoples around the world, even though most of them have now become independent of Britain. They maintain the English language and the British style of government. It's easily recognizable in many, many nations. And certainly English as a language, as a working language around the world, there's nothing comes close to it. Nothing. China has far more people than any other nation on earth, and yet English is a working language for many of the people of China who deal with the rest of the world. And although it wasn't perfect, Britain is an example of how an empire can spread good around the world, even though it usually ends up being resented, because people eventually, as they grow up, as they mature as a nation, they resent being told what to do by someone who brought them up or who gave them birth, really, eventually. But consider the other kind of empire that is more like a cancer as it spreads its aggressiveness and its destructiveness to other nations, that in fact it destroys rather than builds up. The German empires. There were three major Reichs. Reich means empire in German. Were based upon little more than a war machine. In contrast to, for example, the British Empire, which also had a mighty war machine, but was based upon commerce. The British Empire was founded upon trade, upon business, not upon the sheer will to go out and conquer the world. The British people weren't like that. You look at the history of the British Empire, it was not like that. It was based upon commerce. The British Navy, the mighty British Navy, was founded as a means to protect its ships, its trading ships, as they made their way around the world, doing business. And as they did business, the British civilization found itself planted in all those different nations, and then politically, and so on. In many cases, the British brought government where there was none. And eventually, those people matured as a nation, just naturally as naturally happens, and became independent. And when that happened, the British left. But they did a fantastic job for human history. That's undeniable, even though many people do deny it. But again, using Hitler as an example of a negative empire, Hitler's war machine was based upon Hitler's lust to rule the world. That's what his empire was about, just as Bismarck's empire before him was about. Those Reichs. The German people are intelligent, they're advanced, but every once in a while they get a leader who sets them off on the wrong path. And that's happened to other nations as well. When you match that kind of power, intellectual power, industrial power, with a leader who misleads people, you get something very bad out of it. And by the way, the German Empire is directly related to prophecy and how the Roman Empire would survive right up to the time of Jesus Christ. The Roman Empire isn't done yet. That's actually the subject of another sermon. But it's true. It's going to exist at that time. And certainly Germany is going to be the very heart of it. The German title, Kaiser, which you've heard of, most of you I'm sure, is derived directly from the Roman title Caesar. It's simply a German pronunciation of the Roman word Caesar. And Germans have played a major role in the history of Europe and the cyclical rise and fall of that Roman Empire. It's well known to history that the Roman Empire fell, but it really didn't fall. It just sort of tripped and fell and got up again, because it did not die. It fell but didn't die. It was the Germanic warlord Odoacer that wounded the Roman political empire in 476, that many people consider to be the end of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire, but it really didn't. The Germanic Charlemagne brought it back to life again in the 8th century. And it was the German King Otto I, who was regarded as the founder of that so-called Holy Roman Empire. They began to take over and rule Christianity. The Vatican, the popes in Rome, became in cahoots with the Roman emperors, who by then were Germans, German Empire. And that's how it became known officially, the German Empire, as the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. So you see how it has evolved. That political entity, that religious entity, that apostate entity became political. And certainly the history of the popes and the Roman emperors, or the Germanic emperors of that Holy Roman Empire, they were all mostly Germans, their history together was a struggle and an alliance for control, both over each other and of all of Europe, and in prophecy, eventually, for all the world. They are an example of an evil empire, truly evil, as again an example of Adolf Hitler, who was the Third Reich, the Third Empire. Otto's was the First Reich, Otto von Bismarck's was the Second Reich, and Hitler's was the Third Reich. You're well familiar with the term the Third Reich. Well, it means Third Empire. So you can see how an empire can be something good or it can be something very bad. Empires aren't necessarily a bad thing. The empires of the Bible were actually a little of both, examples of both. The Greeks were more of an empire of civilization, although they were militarily powerful. That's how they managed to spread their power. As we will explain today, the Greek Empire is actually the subject of our sermon. Well, the Roman Empire was just an empire of sheer brute force, war for war's sake. And they were right because they had the power. They simply killed anyone who said they were wrong. Might makes right, and that was really what the Roman Empire was about. Throughout the time of Israel's history, the Egyptian Empire is probably one of the best known, mostly because of the Exodus, how the Israelites entered Egypt as the honored guests of one of their own. The Israelite patriarch Joseph was actually second in command to all of Egypt at that time, and of the Egyptian Empire. And that was an Israelite who did that. He was second only to the Pharaoh himself. And, of course, after Joseph's death, new pharaohs came along. They began to view the Israelites as a threat, and so eventually rendered them into slaves. And, of course, the Exodus came of that. But they were there over 4 centuries. The Assyrian Empire peaked next in terms of the relationship to Israel's history. Its capital was Nineveh in what is today central and northern Iraq. And it was the Assyrian Empire, of course, that conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and took the people of those 10 tribes, those so-called lost 10 tribes, off into oblivion, historical oblivion. They still exist. We know that from prophecy in which Israel and Judah will be gathered. So obviously they still exist now if they're going to be in existence in the future. So they're lost, but they're not gone. And why did the Lord have that happen? That also is something, the old saying that history repeats itself, it surely does. If you read history over and over and over and over again, things happen. The same reasons. 2 Kings 17:22, for the children of Israel walked in the sins of Jeroboam, which he did, they departed not from them, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by his servants the prophets. So Israel was carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. And they still haven't come back. They became part of the exodus of the Assyrians themselves when they eventually fell to the Babylonians. So the next empire, again, the series of empires. The Babylonian capital was Babylon, naturally, which is in today central Iraq. Now you see also how Iraq has been a focus of many events of Israel's history and of world history. The Lord had the Babylonians conquer the people of Judah for the same reason that we just read about. Again, history repeats itself, that the Assyrians had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, one of the most famous events, and the destruction of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple, taking of the people of Judah off into their exile temporarily. 2 Chronicles 36:15-23. And the Lord God of their fathers sent to them by his messengers, rising up betimes and sending, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, and despised his words, and misused his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. Therefore he brought upon them the king of the Chaldees, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of the sanctuary, and had no compassion upon the young man or maiden, old man or him that stooped with age, and he gave them all into his hand. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burnt the house of God, and brake down the wall of Jerusalem, and burnt all the palaces thereof with fire, and destroyed all the goodly vessels thereof. And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the prophet Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. Now in the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus king of Persia, All the kingdoms of the earth hath the Lord God of heaven given me, and he hath charged me to build him an house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? The Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. And as stated in those verses, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persian Empire, and it was the Persians who allowed the people of Judah to return. And why did they do that? Because the Lord made them do it. He inspired the leaders to do it. And again, you can see there how the Lord is in control of the rise and fall of empires for his purpose. And when the time comes for them to go, they're going to go. They're going to fall. They're going to decline. Although they don't decline to nothing. All the people of those great empires, the Egyptians are still around, the Babylonians are around, the Assyrians are around, and so on, the Greeks, the Romans, and so on. They're all around, but they cease to be a superpower. They cease to be an empire. They cease to have that power because their time, as being that, their appointed time was up. As with all the empires before or since, as we said, the Persian Empire itself eventually fell to the Greek Empire, and something new to that point in history, a European superpower. Egypt is in Africa. The Assyrian and Babylonian empires were centered in Asia, but Greece is in Europe. So Europe began to take its turn as the ruler of the region that included the land of Israel, the ruler of the world, of the known world at that time. Then Greece fell to Rome, another European superpower. And of course the Roman Empire is well documented in the New Testament. It was the Romans who tortured and crucified Christ, and it was the Romans who martyred many of the people of God of the New Testament. Not necessarily because they were in cahoots with the Jewish people who opposed the non-believing Jewish people, but because the people of God did not worship their divine emperor, the pagan emperor. And certainly the Jews were martyred for that very same reason. by the Romans. They were both viewed as a political threat because they refused to worship the emperor. Christians and Jews, Christians and non-believing Jews and believing Jews were both martyred by the Romans for that reason. And at the same time they were at each other, although the Christians did not persecute the non-believing Jews as much as the non-believing Jews persecuted Christians. That's one thing about true Christians, there wasn't that persecution. Whereas people who, through history, who are thinking they're Christians, certainly the amount of blood that's been spilled on the soil of Europe and throughout the Middle East, the Crusades, and the martyrdoms between Catholics and Protestants and all that's gone on there, they had no hesitation to kill heretics, to burn them alive, skin them alive, saw them in two, torture them, every imaginable way of killing people, the most inhuman, sadistic murders that took place by people who claimed to be Christian. Whereas true Christians have never martyred anybody. That's another difference you will find. True Christians don't commit murder. They don't persecute people. The Greek Empire rose and fell during the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. As most of you know, there is a time gap, a historic gap of time, about 4 centuries, or a little more 4 centuries, between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And as it happens, that's when the Greek Empire reached its peak. So although it is not recorded in the Bible much, its references to its influence are certainly there. The New Testament is written in Greek, so obviously you see the influence that they had there. And the Greek Empire is certainly found in prophecy, very much so, including Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire, and certainly Greek or Greek successor kings were very much a part of Israel's history in those 4 centuries. They were not recorded in the Bible, but the influences of them, and in prophecy, the first incidents of the abomination of desolation occurred during that time, the unrecorded time, although we know of it from history, and it was part of prophecy as well. You can read about that in the Bible in its original form. So today let's have a look at those Greek years, what happened to Israel in the time between the Testaments, in the years that Greece ruled. The Old Testament record ends somewhere around 400 BC, perhaps a little earlier, around 430 approximately, when the Persian Empire was the ruler of the known world. The Persian Empire lasted for another century after the end of the Old Testament era, till the young Greek prince by the name of Alexander took control of the Greek military and began an onslaught of conquering such as the world has really never known. No one has ever really come close to what Alexander did. He was a brilliant tactician and reckless and lucky. There are a number of incidents where he is recorded. He was a leader in the true leader sense. He was not a stay-behind commander. He actually led his troops into battle and was a fierce fighter. There are recorded incidents where he chopped his way so far ahead of his own troops that he was leading that he was actually surrounded by the enemy, where a number of his own troops had to go and rescue the commander because he'd got so far ahead of his own column, which is an amazing situation. But it shows just how fierce he was and how courageous he was. Some would use the word foolhardy there, because there is a difference between being a brave man and being a reckless one. But Alexander was, if not all of that, certainly very lucky. And he was a brilliant tactician. He knew how to fight a war, but he also knew how to bring about battles in a way that he would win, and how he kept that onslaught going from across southern Europe through the Middle East and as far much farther, in fact, than any other empire had ever done. He was the conqueror of the world. There is that story, whether it's true or not, that when he reached the end to India, that his troops simply wouldn't fight any farther because they believed that they were getting so far beyond their ability to rule what they'd been already conquering that they refused to go. And Alexander recognized that, and at that point he sort of sat down and cried. That's part of the legend, that he sat down and cried because he had no more world to conquer. So he was certainly very imperialistic in that sense. And he was a very young man. You can understand his impetuousness in battle. He was only 33 when he died. Cause of death is unknown. He lived from about 356 to 323 BC. The cause of death, some have attributed to typhoid, others from a party, overindulgence, partying over his latest victory, or whatever it was, but he was only about 33 when he died. But during that time he became, as we said, one of the most successful military commanders in human history. He actually conquered the region that had been occupied by all of the previous empires up to that time: Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian, and more. He actually reached to India. Alexander was the son of King Philip II of Macedon, so he was certainly put into the position that he had by his father, and he was certainly not just a regular soldier. He was fighting not just to win a war, but to expand his kingdom. He understood that. And actually his conquering began when he put down a rebellion right in Greece, and that sort of built him into, gave him the momentum or the confidence, or whichever way you want to put it, into a conqueror and into a military commander, and he just set off from there. The prophetic book of Daniel was written about 250 years before Alexander was born, and yet it describes him in amazing detail, from his death at a young age to his being succeeded by his 4 generals. And although, as we said, the Greek Empire was not recorded live, so to speak, as was done with that of Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and Rome, the Greek Empire was, nevertheless, undeniably and is undeniably identified in prophecy, centuries before it happened. It is plainly described. There is no way any honest person, as far as I'm concerned, can deny it. Daniel 8, 1-8, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the capital, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, I was at the river Ulai. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the river. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and magnified himself. As I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the river, and he ran at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come close to the ram, and was enraged against him, and struck the ram, and broke his 2 horns, and the ram had no power to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground, and trampled upon him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the he-goat magnified himself exceedingly, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now that describes Alexander, the latter part of that prophecy as it's led to there, and the division of his kingdom into 4 after his death, exactly as it happened. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. That's the 4 directions speaking in terms of directions from the land of Israel. Now, how can we be sure? That was talking about the Greek king who conquered Persia, and then after he died, his kingdom was divided into 4. Is that my interpretation, or is that someone's interpretation, or is that just somebody's guess? No. Daniel 11:2-4, plain as day. And keep in mind that this prophecy was given to Daniel while the Persian Empire was still the world superpower. Alexander wasn't even born yet when this prophecy was given to Daniel. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he had risen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the dominion which he had ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, and go to others besides these. So it's also describing that by he had no posterity, meaning he had no children. Otherwise, they would have succeeded him, but instead it went to his 4 generals, exactly as described there. And even plainer, more. So you see, we don't have to interpret what the Bible says. The Bible explains itself. Because even plainer, Daniel 8:20-22, as for the ram which you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the he-goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that he was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. So you see, the Bible does record that Greek superpower. It does record Alexander. But it just does it, and does it with amazing accuracy long before it happened. Those who reject the Bible have a very big problem with that prophecy, because most of them are honest enough to admit that it was written long before the rise of Greece, in the time of Daniel, while Persia was yet the superpower, and long before Alexander and what is so accurately described about him, right down to his early death without children, and that his kingdom was divided by 4 of his generals. It's all there in the prophecy. But it was written centuries before, about 2.5 centuries before it happened. So historians recognize who that's talking about, because it's very plain. It identifies the king of Persia being defeated by that king of Greece, who died without posterity, without children, and had his kingdom divided into 4. That's exactly what happened. And it's never happened to anyone else. And it's plainly talking about the king of Greece defeating the king of Persia. It's plain as day. It doesn't need any interpretation. But those who deny prophecy have a very big problem with that one. Very, very big problem. Because they know history. They know what happened, but they deny that prophecy prophesied it, and did so with amazing accuracy. Absolutely amazing. In terms of what Alexander did. It's right there in the Bible, written centuries before it happened. So you see, the Greek Empire is there, but it's just not. It was recorded in that way before it happened. After Alexander's death, his empire was taken over by 4 of his generals, mainly. There were others in the struggle, but it came down to 4 of them, who became known as the successors of Diadochi, which 2 of them primarily had a direct effect on the land of Israel and on Bible history and prophecy. Syria and Babylon went to Seleucus, and Egypt went to Ptolemy, names which are familiar to most of you. The land of Israel, which was situated between those 2 power bases, was first held by Syria and then by Egypt from about 301 BC, and then back to Syria again when Antiochus the Great took it in 198 BC. So you can see that relationship, political and military, was never simple. It was not just a black and white simple situation. The knives were always out. There was always somebody looking to take over the other guy, and Sooner or later they did. It's just that's been the history of empires. Sooner or later somebody bigger or richer or someone with an advantage or someone who is taking advantage of your problems is going to take what you have, and that's just the way it's been throughout history. Empires, one after another, never lasted. It's just the way it is. Things can change. Whoever would have thought, if you growing up in the 1960s, could ever imagine that the Soviet Union would decline and fade away as it has? You'd never think about it, that such a thing could happen. Who would have believed it? With the massive amount of power in the United States in the Cold War situation with the Russians, and who knows who's ever going to start a nuclear war if one stepped over the line into the other's territory, kind of a thing. Europe was armed to the teeth. The Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall and all of that. Whoever would have believed it? That here we are not all that much longer later in the Soviet Union. Russia is still there, of course. It's still a big nation. It's still powerful. But it's not what it was, is it? It certainly isn't. So you see, and that in a relatively short time, how a nation can decline. Just as a nation, also an empire can come out of nowhere very fast. If you look at, for example, Germany, again, to use that example, at the end of the First World War, Germany was defeated, it was occupied, it was militarily outlawed, and then in 1920, and yet 20 years later, it was a superpower again. It overran Europe, it took on Russia, Britain, the United States, Canada, many nations around the world. Germany alone did that. Certainly Japan was part of it in the other part of the world, but they never fought together to any great degree. Germany alone just went on a rampage, and they did that only 20 years after they were reduced to ashes. So you see how fast things can rise and how fast things can fall. Again, the Soviet Union, the example, how the air just went out of it very quickly. It's a lesson that a lot of empires have learned. In fact, all empires have learned. But getting back to after the death of Alexander, the two primary power bases were to the east and to the west. The west down in Egypt and the east in Babylon, or Syria. Seleucus was the Macedonian general who acquired the area, the vast eastern section of the empire, centered on the old Babylonian Empire. And from him was established the Seleucid dynasty that lasted something over 2.25 centuries, from about 312 BC. So you see, it lasted a long time. It's not as though, if you take a historic view, a long view, you see how thinking in just a matter of 1 century isn't all that long. You have to take a much longer view in order to get a bigger picture or a clearer picture and understand how things in the long term change, just as they can change very quickly in the short term, as we've seen too. It began when Seleucus received the satrapy of Babylonia in 321 BC from Antipater, the administrator of Alexander's kingdom. So it didn't just happen. He lost it for a while again to Antigonus, who was another of Alexander's former generals. The knives were out there. They were all politically ambitious men, none of which were a match for Alexander alone. The fact that the kingdom was broken into 4 major pieces, something that Alexander ruled alone, is proof of that. But Seleucus regained control after the Battle of Gaza in about 312 BC, and in 306 BC assumed the title of king as Seleucus I, or Seleucus Nicator. His territory extended over a vast part of Alexander's former empire. However, the land of Israel still remained contested between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, primarily because it was on a border. It's sort of right in the frontier between them. It's very easy between Syria and Egypt. So you see how a frontier between two powerful nations waiting for the other to get into some kind of other distraction or some sort of trouble to take advantage of a situation. And usually that's what happened. They didn't exactly confront each other directly, often. Seleucus was assassinated in 281 BC, and a couple dozen successors of Seleucus then took their turns as rulers of the Seleucid kingdom. Most of them, their names are completely unfamiliar to us, to most people who read the Bible, but one of them is very familiar to people who have studied Bible history and prophecy, and he is Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. That name is familiar to many of you. Many of his subjects called him the madman for obvious reasons, because he was completely power mad, godlike in his mind. He thought he was sort of a god. And when he came to power, he very quickly proved himself to be no friend of the Jews in the land of Israel. He mounted an effort to destroy them and the worship of the true God. He had any Jew, and keeping in mind also that I'm speaking of the land of Israel, but the people of Israel, those northern 10 tribes, were long gone, and that the people of Judah, the Jews, had just returned relatively, again, in a matter of centuries, from their Babylonian exile. They were back, but they were not for very long a country or a nation or an independent nation. Again, they kept being overrun by these powerful empires. And Antiochus, some of them were not all that bad toward the Jewish people, but others, such as Antiochus, were absolute beasts. They were brutes. They were just totally evil. And certainly Antiochus was evil toward the people of God, or the most visible people of God at that time. He had anybody who observed the Sabbath put to death. He had mothers who had circumcised children put to death along with the children. He burned many of the scrolls, the scriptures that were any ones that he could get his hands on. Some believe that it was likely from that many of the hidden scrolls that have been found out in the desert, many of them have been found that they were originally put there because of that destruction by Antiochus, and then perhaps those who put them there were killed or died or just never got back to get them, and there they remained all those years. But the greatest outrage committed by Antiochus Epiphanes occurred in 167 BC, as you well know, when he entered the temple in Jerusalem and erected an altar to the pagan god Zeus and sacrificed a pig on it in the temple of God. That desecration triggered the well-known Maccabean revolt by the Hasmoneans, or known as the Maccabees. Their eventual victory and the cleansing of the temple is still commemorated to this day by Jews in their annual festival of Hanukkah. That's right, Hanukkah. So you see how, and that this is something that began between the Testaments, and yet Hanukkah obviously still is observed today by Jews because it's something very specific to them. That so-called abomination of desolation is also a very familiar term to most readers of the Bible. It's actually a dual prophecy that was given to Daniel, first in referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, but also to an end-time abomination of desecration that Jesus Christ said is going to happen. It hasn't happened yet. He's referring to the time just before his return in which it will happen again. Matthew 24:15-25, one of the most famous prophecies, or part of one of the most famous prophecies of the Bible, Matthew 24. That entire chapter deals with the situation in the world and the situation in the land of Israel just prior to his return. Matthew 24:15-25, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, nor on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as not since the beginning of this world to this time, no ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say to you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not, for there shall have arisen false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. And as stated there, Jesus was directly referring to that prophecy by Daniel, which can be found in Daniel 9:27. It's dual. It's dual in nature. It's dual in fulfillment. Part of it has been fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes. But as Jesus Christ said plainly in the time just prior to his return, it's going to happen again. Daniel 9:27, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. And a little more clearly, Daniel 11:31, and arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that make desolate. And keeping in mind that Jesus spoke there very specific. Many interpret that to mean some sort of desolation of the church, or some sort of thing about the Jewish people, what they're doing or not doing. But Jesus Christ was very specific. He described Judea, a specific location, when he was talking about the abomination of desolation. So it's not an everywhere kind of thing. At least everywhere in terms of the focus of it, or the origin of it, or what is going to be actually happening in that specific place. So as you see, it is a dual prophecy, but it gives a very, very good clue as to what's involved and where it's involved. It's going to be the exact same place. And whether or not the Jewish people are going to build another temple, I think they are. I think prophecy plainly says that in Judea, in Jerusalem, and all of that. And we've covered that in other studies and other sermons. As I said, though, that Antiochus Epiphanes was a foreshadow of that greater abomination of desecration to come. But what Antiochus did was no little thing at that time, way back then. It was a foreshadow, that's true, but it was a very big thing at that time. It triggered the rebellion by, as we said, a group of Jews led by the priest Matthias and his 5 sons. They took on an empire. They did. And so what made them think they should do that, or had the power to do that, or had any hope of doing that? But their faith in God. You know, what chance could they have had? But they had a big chance, because they won. As it turns out, they won. When Matthias died in 166, the leadership of the movement went to his son Judas, who was nicknamed the Maccabee, which means the hammer, which kind of gives you an idea of whether they were just talkers or not. And the name Maccabee was also used for other members of the family, so you see how the origin of that name came. But with a lot of bravery and a lot of military genius, they beat that superpower that was running the country for them. And not just beat them in battle, they actually gained their independence as a nation. They took back the temple, they rededicated it to the God of Israel, as we said, and that eventual victory, or that victory, was the origin of the holy day, of the Jewish holy day of Hanukkah. But it lasted. It wasn't just the taking back from a single battle. That Maccabean period, or Hasmonean period as some call it, or the period of independence, lasted from about 167 to 63 BC. A good century, during which the land of Israel was ruled by the family of Judas, the Maccabees. So you see, they took on a superpower and they won. They actually gained their independence. And it lasted until the Romans took the country in 63 BC or so. But in order for the Romans to do that, they also had to defeat another major force of that former part of Alexander's kingdom, and that was the Ptolemies in Egypt. And some very famous names there. They're very familiar to you, and it surprised a lot of people. You've heard of Cleopatra? Well, first of all, she really did exist. There were actually a number of Cleopatras, but many people are surprised of Cleopatra's biblical connection, and how the political battles that she was involved in involved a man who was also involved in the birth of Christ. And they were all very real people. So let's have a look at that now. Ptolemy was the Macedonian general who, as another of the successors of Alexander, acquired Egypt, and from him was established the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled for not quite 3 centuries until the murder of Ptolemy the 15th, or Caesarion, the 17-year-old son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, by order of Octavian in about 30 BC. So some very famous names there. Cleopatra and, of course, Julius Caesar and Octavian. Well, he's not generally known as much by that name, but he's very famous to anyone who has read the Bible, as we'll get to in a moment. Although Ptolemy and his successors were and remained Greeks, they adopted many Egyptian customs, seeking to rule in the tradition of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, even though they were Greeks. They also involved themselves in incestuous marriages, as was apparently quite common among the pharaohs. The Ptolemaic kings, all 15 of whom were named Ptolemy, often married their sisters, who were commonly named Cleopatra, which means from the Greek Cleopatris, meaning famous parents. That's what the word or the name Cleopatra means. It means famous parents, but it was incestuous. So they weren't exactly all that moral in terms of their marriages. One Egyptian custom that they did not adopt, however, was the language. The Ptolemies were Greek speakers, and they made Greek the official language of Egypt, which is sort of surprising, but considering that it was an occupied country and by Greek rulers, then naturally they would keep their own language, and they did. Surprisingly, that the name Egypt itself is a Greek word. It's not actually what the Egyptian word for Egypt is, so you can see how much influence it had. Ptolemy moved the capital of Egypt from Memphis to Alexandria, that city that was named after Alexander. That's where Alexandria got its name, after Alexander the Great. And from there the Ptolemies ruled their empire, which extended for the land of Egypt to Israel and up into Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. It wasn't quite as large in territory, but it was certainly at least as grand in terms of how they conducted themselves. Certainly, as I said, in the spirit of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Alexandria also became one of the greatest ancient centers of knowledge and trade. A very famous library was founded there, which doesn't exist anymore, but at its time, at its peak, it was one of the most marvelous libraries, the greatest libraries that ever existed. It was unfortunately destroyed, and very little of it remains today. The Jews in the city adopted Greek ways, many of them Greek ways and language. The Septuagint, the Old Testament translation into Greek rather than Hebrew, was made by Jewish scholars in Alexandria. They had the freedom to do that. So you can see there how empires aren't always necessarily just warmongering aggressors out to conquer everybody. They oftentimes brought civilization to people who needed it or wanted it. So it wasn't always just a bad thing. And you can see there why empires prosper. If it's certainly if there's something in it for the people who are part of that empire, then they're happy to have it. But it's only when they become negative or harmful to the people, or overbearing or arrogant or criminal or whatever, and how they're ruling people, that a rebellion happens. And again, that's what happened. It's over and over it's happened. But you can see there that for a time, for the perspective of the people of Judah, they benefited from it. They were not overall persecuted by them. Certainly not the way they were by Antiochus over in Syria, nor were they by the Babylonians when they were conquered there, nor were how they were treated by the Romans. So overall, they did quite well there in Egypt that time. Eventually, however, because human nature doesn't change, the Ptolemaic kingdom was weakened by both internal struggles for control, typical human politics, and also of the growing power of the Roman Empire, which was not yet a superpower, but was on its way to becoming one. Cleopatra VII was the last and generally most well-known of the Ptolemaic rulers. And although, as we said, there were many Cleopatras, she is the one that made that name famous. And yes, she was very real. A lot of people think that she was just someone in a movie that didn't really exist, but there really was a Cleopatra. There are actually a number of them, but as I said, that one in particular is the one that made the name famous. Cleopatra reigned with the political support of that very famous Roman leader Julius Caesar, with whom she had a son, as we mentioned. After Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome, Cleopatra became involved with the Roman general Mark Antony, another very famous name of ancient history. And it was a love and power relationship that lasted for about 10 years. It ended when the forces of Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by Octavian in the Battle of Actium, after which Cleopatra, who was then about 39, and Mark Antony, who was older, something in his early 50s, both committed suicide. She apparently by having a poisonous snake bite her. Egypt was thereafter absorbed by the Roman Empire, which was on the rise. And who was that Octavian that we mentioned, who defeated Antony and Cleopatra? But he's not often known by that name. He's much better known to readers of the Bible as Caesar Augustus, after he became the Caesar, who we read of in Luke 2:1-7. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that in all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. And Joseph went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. So you see, Octavian, who defeated Antony and Cleopatra years earlier, because of that victory, rose to power, and he was the one that therefore had the power to call that census that caused Joseph and Mary to travel down to Bethlehem, and why Christ was born there. So you see the connection, the historic connection between all those people. And it's amazing how, as I said, many people think that Cleopatra was a fictitious character, that she didn't really exist, but she most certainly did. She's very real. So you can see also how the Greek Empire, although it happened in the time between the recorded Old and New Testament eras, it is still, nevertheless, very much a part of the Old and New Testament, both in history and prophecy. It's recorded and spoken of in prophecy, and certainly many of the events, as we described, all were connected. They're all part of that single flow of events of Bible history right from the beginning, right from the first verse of Genesis. It all was part of that flow of events that continued on right through the time, even though those particular 4 centuries are not recorded live, but they were certainly recorded as part of prophecy, and there's certainly the events and the results of them certainly were part of Bible history, as though there was no gap there at all. It's just very much a part of all that came to be. And certainly Greek and the Greek people are still very much referred to in the New Testament. The Greek language was used to write the New Testament. So you see how powerful the Greek influence had been, because many of the Jews at the time were actually Greek speakers, as we described from their experience in Alexandria, where they had the freedom to do that, to the scholarship and the great library there, and how everything was available to them, and they could go about their lives and their learning and their religion, and no one gave them a whole lot of trouble from that, at least for that short time, overall, at least compared to the way it had been. But the Greek references in the New Testament are also still very much there. Just a few of those. We're running out of time. John 19:19-20 And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Then this title then read, Many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city. And it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. So you see, even the sign, that very famous sign on the cross of Christ, part of it was written in Greek. So you see the influence there. John 12:20, and there were certain Greeks among them that came up to worship at the feast. So they observed the holy days, those non-Israelite people. There were many Greeks among the early church. They were founders of it, along with many other people. Acts 14:1, and it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake that a great multitude, both of the Jews and also of the Greeks, believed. Oftentimes the way the word is used there, the way Greek is used there, it's almost used as a term for Gentile, where often it will say Jews and Greeks, meaning Israelite and non-Israelite in the greater sense. Although it means specifically Greeks, but it's taken to mean very often Gentile or non-Israelite. Acts 16:1, and there came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there, named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman, which was a Jewess, and believed, but his father was a Greek. So you see intermarriage happened there as well. And certainly they had a double trouble there to overcome, not only the mixed marriage, but one was a believer and one was not. So obviously I'm sure there was a lot of stress in that marriage between that couple. Although their son, Timothy, or Timotheus, the Greek version of his name, certainly turned into a believer, as his mother was, and we don't know if the father eventually became one or not. He wasn't at the time that was written, apparently. Acts 17:3-4, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead, that this Jesus whom I preach unto you is Christ. And some of them believed, and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude. So you see the Greeks, we often think of them as the pagans, and they have their pagan gods and all the pagan philosophy and everything, but also a great many Greeks became Christians at that time. At the time when many of the people of Judah were still rejecting their own Messiah, which is very ironic. Acts 18:4, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. So again, you see the connection there in how the word is used sometimes both ways, both Jews meaning Jews and Greeks meaning Greeks specifically, but also Israelite and Gentile in that way. It's used both ways. Acts 21:28-29, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place, where they had seen him before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And again, that may have been a reference, sort of, to Antiochus Epiphanes, the Greek, polluting the temple, so they were still very touchy about having Greeks coming near the temple or in the temple, but he actually didn't take him into the temple anyway. Paul didn't do that. He was accused falsely there, but you can see there how that was still apparently a very touchy subject there, and rightfully so, considering what they'd been through, and how they just decided never again is that going to happen. And again, also from that time, much of Judaism began. There many of their own traditions that were really never a part of what was observed by the people of Judah before the Babylonian exile. And when they returned from that, they decided, well, never again is the Lord going to punish us for being so disobedient. We're going to observe His law, they thought, and they wanted to do it by adding a whole mountain of their own laws and traditions to sort of enhance God's law, when all they really needed to do was just obey God's law, as God had already given it to them. But instead they added all sorts of their own laws and traditions. And certainly it came from the Babylonian exile, but also from what Antiochus Epiphanes did, that desecration there. Certainly that would have been a part of it. And that reference that we just read about Greeks coming near the temple, that seemed still to be a very touchy subject, and that was certainly a long time after Antiochus Epiphanes. So it was something still very fresh in their minds, as it is today. I mean, the Jews, people of Judah, still observe Hanukkah. So naturally it's still in their minds even today. So it was a touchy subject, but the thing is, they went overboard in creating so many of their own laws and traditions that Jesus Christ rebuked them for. He told them, here you are ignoring the true law of God and worshiping according to your own laws and traditions. They accused the Messiah of being a sinner because he was observing God's law rather than all of the man-made laws and traditions of Judaism. I mean, Judaism is based upon the law of God, but they've added so many other things that sometimes the actual law of God is way down, is buried by all of these laws of themselves that they've created for themselves. And surprisingly, Moses never knew or observed them or knew of them. If Moses came back today, he would look at Judaism and wonder what many of the things that they are doing are all about, because he never observed them. The people of Israel, those northern 10 tribes, they never knew it either. They never knew any of that because they never came back, first of all, but they were never part of that return from Babylon and the response to what Antiochus Epiphanes did, that desecration of the temple, the abomination of desolation. So they may have had the right idea to be pure in their worship to God, but all they purely had to do was just obey what they already had, rather than all sorts of things that just got in the way of that reality, that got in the way of what the Lord said to do, and just to do. Never mind all your own traditions. Romans 10:12-13. For there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. That says it all, doesn't it? That says it all. Salvation is open to everybody. Everyone who repents. You have to repent. It's not just open to everyone, it's open to everyone who repents. Because Christ died for repentant sinners. Unrepentant sinners are headed for the lake of fire. Anyone. Salvation is open to anyone. Anyone, everywhere, who repents. And to that end, and to end today's sermon, that is what Christianity is all about. Galatians 3:26-28. For ye are all the children of God by faith in Jesus Christ. For as many of you as been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Thank you for joining us for services this week. As always, your being with us makes our joy complete. Until next week, when we meet again on this, God's holy Sabbath day, may the Lord bless thee and keep thee. May the Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. God bless you all.